Our next speaker, Cristina Saunders, began her tenure as lake manager for Deep Creek this year. And not to make a pun, as most of you know, she jumped right in. Goal 5 of the Watershed Management Plan calls for management of SAVs in the lake to maintain and improve the ecological stability of the lake while working with waterfront landowners to minimize interference of SAVs with recreational uses around the docks. That's an easy thing to say. Well, Christina's talk today is entitled Submerged Aquatic Vegetation Management in Deep Creek Lake, and she will tell you something about a pilot project that she jumped right into when she started her job related to SAVs. Cristina?
Thank you, everybody. I have the dreaded time slot of right after lunch, so I hope I can keep you all awake. So today, like Dave said, I'm going to be talking about submerged aquatic vegetation management here in Deep Creek Lake. And one thing I do want to touch on is just a common theme that we've been hearing throughout the presentations this entire day, and that is balancing recreation, economic opportunities, and ecological resources. I don't know about you, but that's a very tall order because a lot of these things conflict with each other. So it's my job to try to find the best way to kind of coast in the middle, and I'm going to not say swear words, make people the least amount angry as I can, but not guaranteed that I won't make somebody angry because it is what it is. It's the nature of the position. And I think that the previous presentations today really helped um, line up my talk. So I'm not going to go too into some of the ecological roles of aquatic vegetation because we've been hearing it all morning, but I am going to emphasize that it is important. So today I'm going to cover some background information as to why we came up with this pilot study. And again, I'm just going to lightly touch on the ecological role of SAV in the lake, and then our objectives, and then considerations, big considerations being aquatic invasive species, that's AIS, impacts to fisheries, and impacts to native SAV. Again, because it is important. So as we were looking at ways to move forward with management techniques for SAV in the lake, we came up with the harvester pilot study. So I'm going to kind of talk to you about what that study is, where we're at, and what our next steps are going to be. So as everybody has, as you've heard many times today already, SAV is a natural part of our ecosystem. It has a ton of ecological benefits to the lake. Despite this, it can become overgrown in some areas and become a hindrance to recreation. And currently the only methods that we have to handle this SAV in the lake is mechanical removal. And by mechanical, I don't mean the harvester study that we're looking into. I mean physically going out with a rake, throwing it off your dock, and pulling the SAV out. So that's one option. And then the other option that we have are benthic mats. But aside from that, that is about all that we have in the lake. And that management is an individual responsibility. So whoever, has the issue with SAV, it's their own personal responsibility to manage it around their docks. They do come to our office to get permits or permissions. We'll go out and make sure that there's any like hydrilla or invasive species or any other concerns before letting people do that. So we've been looking for additional ways to manage SAV, and that's where we came up with the harvester feasibility pilot study. I'm going to go ahead and just touch quickly on this slide, just again emphasizing what we've been saying. SAV is important. It can become a hindrance to recreation, but it does provide oxygen to the lake, and as we know, that is a vital resource. The critters in the lake do need that, and it's not something that we naturally have a ton of. So it does help provide oxygen for the lake. It provides food, habitat, and nursery areas for fish and aquatic invertebrates. It absorbs nutrients, and as it absorbs those nutrients, it reduces the risk of having algal blooms. Algal blooms can sometimes be harmful and cause illnesses, respiration issues, make your dog sick, nasty stuff. So it does help reduce the risk of that. Improves water clarity, again, by removing those nutrients from the water. And it also can help reduce the amount of erosion to the shoreline because it absorbs that energy that comes in from any boating activity or wind activity, stuff like that. It's also a major food source for waterfowl. Believe it or not, ducks don't just eat bread. They love wild celery, which is one of our native SAVs in the lake. And it can also help prevent the invasion of invasive species because it's already taking up space. That's less space that, for example, hydrilla can come in and overtake. So our objectives is, despite the benefits that SAV does have, it does hinder recreation and boating. And there have been residents that have expressed concerns about it becoming a nuisance in some areas. So we've been looking at additional management strategies using data-driven information to make our decisions. So we don't just want to go out and think that something sounds really good and do it. We want to make sure that we are looking at the data prior to ensure that it's something that is feasible for the lake, and again, look at all the considerations that go into that decision. And that's where we have come up with our harvester feasibility pilot study. So for those that don't know, the harvester, it is essentially a giant aquatic water lawnmower. It goes around the lake. It has a sickle blade on the front. It can go down and it just oscillates and cuts the vegetation that way. It was transported in from Massachusetts. We did have to get some bids to see, get the best bang for our buck, essentially, since we work for the state. And we've started that project this summer. We just completed our cuttings, and I'm going to talk a lot more into that. But some of our considerations, our big considerations, we're looking at invasive species. So specifically in the lake, hydrilla is one of our biggest concerns. As Bruce had touched on earlier, it was discovered in our lake in 2013, and then we implemented some management for that hydrilla to control it. It's been very successful. Our control efforts have been very successful. I believe there were 13 original spots. Is that correct, Rich? 13? It was around 13. And we were down to 3 last year that we were treating. And we do, with the help with resource assessment services, we go through and dive annually to keep tabs on the historical sites where SAV has been located before. And so far, the treatment efforts have been very successful with only 3 spots. However, this year during the harvester study, we did find 2 new occurrences of hydrilla over in the kind of Arrowhead, Honey area. So it does still pop up. It can surprise us, but we're working to manage that. So that's really concerning because the way that hydrilla can spread throughout the lake is through its fragments. So we want to make sure that if we are allowing a different type of management technique for these, for the SAV, what's that mean when it comes to the spread of invasive species? So we're looking at making sure that we're doing proper surveys to ensure that if this harvester is a feasible option for our lake, we're at least going out there and getting ahead of it beforehand so that we're not accidentally spreading hydrilla, trying to manage our native SAV. And then another big point is just that, like I mentioned, the harvester came from Massachusetts. So this isn't local equipment that we have. Maybe eventually it will be, but as of right now, it's not just local equipment that we do have. So we do have to make sure that whoever is contracted to come in and do this is a responsible contractor and, is making sure that they're decontaminating their equipment before bringing it to our body of water. Fisheries is another big consideration because SAV is nursery habitat to juvenile fish species. So when we did this study, we realized that bycatch is a high potential, and we wanted to determine the impact to the fisheries. So to do that, we worked with DNR Fisheries specifically on this project so that they could come in afterwards. We had the harvester go out and collect the cuttings, harvest the grass, and it has a conveyor belt on it, so it's able to separate out by site. So we knew exactly which clump of grass, SAV, sorry, I'll be technical here. So what clump of SAV came off the harvester? We knew exactly what site it came from, so we could sort through it and see what the impacts were to fisheries. We found crayfish, juvenile fish, went by species, and then invertebrates as well if they were in there. Additional to crayfish because they're also invertebrates. There are many trophy species in Deep Creek Lake, and a lot of them are ambush predators. So this SAV provides habitat for that. It's not just juvenile fish that uses habitat. It's also, a lot of our ambush predators, which are trophy species. So again, trying to balance recreation between fisheries resources, people who like to fish, people who enjoy that type of recreation versus boating, swimming, stuff like that. And then taking all of this information and looking at the implications to the food web, because like I said, invertebrates, juvenile fish, predatory fish, and also waterfowl because they use it as a food source. And then also our native SAV. So this comes into the question, what is nuisance SAV, right? We keep using the term nuisance SAV. What does that mean? Does it mean that I was swimming and it touched my leg and I didn't like it? Or does it mean I cannot operate my boat through it? So trying to figure out what nuisance is defined as is something that we need to look at, because again, it has all of these great benefits. And then another point is large-leaf pondweed, Potamogeton amphisilus, is native to Maryland. It was once thought to be extirpated until it was found again, and it is prevalent in Deep Creek Lake. So, we have a lot of very cool species of native vegetation that live in this lake, and we want to make sure we're being responsible stewards and doing the right thing, while also balancing everything else. So this is the aquatic harvester. I was trying to kind of explain it earlier, but it is essentially a giant water lawnmower, and you can see the sickle blades, and it's kind of hard to see, but at where the cutting edges, they have that conveyor belt, and that conveyor belt does have grids that are about this big. And the intent of those grids is to have juvenile fish fall through, right? So as it's collecting the material, it's collecting the materials, the fish are able to fall through. The problem with that is if you're in an area that is very dense, it mats up. And then those grids become effectively useless because it is matted with that SAV and the fish are not able to fall through. So those are some of the things that we were looking at as we were looking at impacts to fisheries. So when we did this study, we had 3 locations for our study sites. We had a shallow site, an intermediate site, and a deep site. And these locations were selected specifically to avoid impacts to anybody's personal or commercial docks. We wanted to find areas that were somewhat remote to where we were not showing we were just isolating from anybody's own property. So it was difficult to find because we had to find areas that had decent growth of SAV with varying depths and without being close to a dock. And if you've been on Deep Creek Lake, you know that there are docks everywhere around the lake. So that was the reason that we selected the sites that we did. And as we went through our study method, we had each site, we did a pre and post cut SAV survey. So we had divers get into the water. Before we started, we did a calibration survey. Huge kudos to Resource Assessment Services for coming out and helping us calibrate our efforts and learn how to do the SAV surveys appropriately and comparably. So we had a little bit of a calibration effort where we would go through and put down a transect and get our results and then compare and make sure that we were all kind of aligned on the same page. So we would do that. And then we did a pre-cut and a post-cut survey. So the way that, I'm just going to go to the next slide to do this, but we did this twice. We had one set of harvesting pre-post-cut in September and then another in late October to see how much growth had occurred in that time frame between. And then we worked with DNR Fisheries again. For DNR Fisheries did some additional sonar surveys to see what the impacts of the cutting looked like using some technical equipment on their boat. So this is my fun little slide that I put together to let you guys see exactly what it looked like, how we did the surveys. So we had a control and an experimental cutting site. Our control site was, that was the site where we did not cut. We left it untouched, but we still surveyed before and after, just like we did the experimental site. And then the experimental site is where the cutting did occur. So we ran a transect line. That's that center dash line. That's the transect line. And it went out 50 to 100 feet, depending on the site. And the reason that there were some discrepancies between distances at the site, for example, the state park site was our deep site. So we only went out 50 meters or 50 feet because anything past 100 feet or 50 feet, there was no SAV growth. It got too deep too quick, so there was no reason to go any further than that. And then the shallower sites, the SAV went farther, so that's why we had that out. That's why we had that slight difference. We had an approximate 10-foot width, and that was for the harvester to cut. So the harvester was going to cut a 10-foot swath. They did 3 runs at it, and that was how we got that 10-foot width. Thinking in terms of kind of like cutting around docks and stuff like that. So that's how we got that distance. And what we did is these little, all these squares that you see with our little scuba divers that are getting ready to swim up, they were our quadrats that we used. So we had a quadrat that we would put down, and that was how we would determine the density and the type of SAV that was within that quadrat. And we had them distributed evenly across the entire transect. So we would take our data. This is our data sheet. So we would be underwater collecting this data at each quadrat site along the transect. And this allowed us to have comparable data for our pre and post cut for both sessions. Now, one thing that did turn into a bit of an issue was, as I mentioned earlier, we did find hydrilla at one of our sites. Luckily, it was not it. So we found the hydrilla post cut, which means the harvester had already come out and cut. But luckily, where the harvester had cut was in a site that we had very thoroughly surveyed. So it did not go through a bed of hydrilla. Luckily, we were very, very happy with that. But it was, I would say, from where I'm standing to that wet floor sign is where the hydrilla was. So luckily, the harvester itself, we did not go through that, but we did discover it. And since we discovered it so late in the season, we had to have some different treatment options that ended up impacting all of the SAV in the area. So we had to pull that site for our second round of cutting. So that site did not get used for the second part, but obviously it was just an adjustment that we had to make. We didn't have another option. So from here on out, like we have the data, we have the pre and post cut data for both cuts. The harvester did come out, did what it needed to do. And now we're at the point where we need to have these discussions where we're trying to determine, again, what qualifies as nuisance SAV versus just native SAV. And that's where we're looking at potentially density requirements. So if the density of SAV around your dock or this area that you're considering using a harvester at meets this criteria, then it makes sense. But again, if it's at a density to where it's just maybe you don't like it, well, it provides an ecological function to the lake, and we need to try to make sure it doesn't turn into a scenario where, well, my neighbor mowed his grass, so now I need to mow my grass, and now I need to mow my grass, and next thing you know, we're losing a lot of our SAV. So we're trying to find the best way to put some handrails on that and make sure that we have we're using good science to make informed decisions. And that's also taking into consideration impacts to fisheries, water quality, all of that going into those decisions. So again, we're still in the working stages. None of this data has been analyzed. These are all the discussions we're currently having. And then in addition to that, like, what's that going to look like for our workload? How's that going to increase our workload? because like I said, someone from my staff or a qualified contractor, someone who has the ability to properly identify invasive species will need to go out beforehand to make sure that it's not there if that's going to be an option that somebody uses. And then lastly, who's responsible for harvesting? Like I said, for this study, the state contracted out from a different agency or contracted out a company from Massachusetts to come in and do this study. So what is that? That's great for the study, but what does this look like in the long term? Who is responsible for harvesting the SAV? Who is responsible for hiring? What does that look like? So these are the inner workings of what we're dealing with right now. So our next steps are to analyze the data and work with all of the partners that came into this to discuss our results and our options, and lastly, write the report. So that is all that I have. I'm sure that there are plenty of questions, so please feel free. And here's my contact information if anybody would like to ask me additional follow-up questions if you forget.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned this piece of equipment came from Massachusetts, and I know that in the Midwest, they do this type of thing. So what did the results from those studies show? Do you have any sense of what you may expect to find?
I think I don't have any good comparative data for any of the Midwest companies. I do know I did come from a lake that did manage SAV, but it was only in high traffic areas. They didn't do it. It wasn't lake wide. It was only in like high traffic recreation areas. So I have seen that, and that was done by the county. They were responsible. It was just kind of like a county rec additional responsibility. So trying to figure out what that looks like for us. And then again, this, to give you a little bit of background for how this study came into place, I've been in this position for about 5 months now, and it was already kind of rolling as soon as I walked in the door. It was already starting to roll. So our first big step was getting the harvester out here and getting data that is specific to our lake, and then going from there. So now we're in that kind of analyzing, comparing, compiling data stage. Yep.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I actually have two, but just the first one's simple. So the benthic mat approach, is that just covering the lake bottom with like a opaque?
Yeah, it's like you think about like your landscape gardening, how you could put like a plastic to keep the.
And that would be effective if you were just treating localized areas.
Yeah, so that's for people who have dock permit. Right. They can apply they can apply for a permit for a benthic mat.
Okay.
And then we don't install them. Somebody else will come out and install them, or they can self-install. But
the second question's more interesting, I think. So that you did that harvesting in that Arrowhead Cove area, that's the same area that Bruce talked about was the dredge zone.
Yep.
Was that like revegetated completely when you went back?
It was vegetated. It was not completely revegetated, but it did have native SAV there as well.
Okay. Yeah. Is it mostly native SAV?
Yeah, it was mostly native.
Okay.
The hydrilla that we found, we did find it was a big bunch of it, but it wasn't the entire cove. It didn't overtake the entire cove.
That would have been how many years after the
it was not the same site. So
oh, gotcha.
It was adjacent. So Arrowhead, but when we treated, when we had to treat, we treated the entire cove just to be safe.
Okay.
Yep.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Oh, there we go.
So the submerged aquatic vegetation grows better because there's nutrients in the water as well as light.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of harvesting it is removing those nutrients that, that would still be in the lake. So,
yep.
I mean, I'm not aware that there's any TMDL for the lake, total maximum
Yeah, yeah.
daily load, or where I come from, too many damn lawyers.
Yeah.
But it's certainly an aspect of nutrient balance in the lake. And so, it seems like if you want to slow the growth of submerged aquatic vegetation in particular,
Mhm.
you need to slow the rate of nutrients coming into the lake. So somehow that needs to tie together.
Yep.
But that needs to be, I think, part of a outreach and education
Yep.
effort
Mhm.
with property owners. So it might be, more effort along those lines. I think that, people just, I touched it. What were you expecting out of the Loch Ness Monster? I mean,
I think it's part of the lake experience.
yeah. Yeah. And when you understand the benefits, it makes a huge difference.
Yep.
So,
And I think we were having a conversation earlier. I think that's just been a lot of we've kind of lacked in letting the public know how important SAV is to the lake, and like knowing what benefits it does provide.
and it's the natural,
Mhm.
role of, lakes, as we saw,
Yep.
the development of the lakes. So,
Yep.
thank you.
Other questions?
So do we have any data on kind of how much the SAVs have increased over the last 10 years? Because I've been on the lake for about 10 years, and I can tell you at the south end of the lake, pretty much any place that's 8 feet or less is
Mhm.
mostly SAVs. And
Yeah,
I'm not as concerned about that, but I always wonder, is there ever too much of a good thing? And that maybe it is taking over other things just because of the volume. And I'd just be curious because it is the south end of the lake that's, lower rated as we look forward.
Yeah, well, the south end of the lake is, it's more shallow. You do have more of that in nutrient input, just based on all the tributaries coming in and such. So it does promote growth more, and that's why we're trying to figure out where the density requirements would look, so that, for areas that are becoming overgrown, where it is becoming a nuisance, that is where we would want to target. Mhm.
Any other questions? I have a quick question. How do you measure, technically, how do you measure density?
So the way that we do it is we put down our quadrat. It's separated into those 4 sections to make it a little bit easier, like 25%, 25%, right? Each one's a 25% of that square. And you just go through and essentially estimate what density is within each transect and get to your total. And that would be by route. So you would be collecting it, how much space it's taking up at the bottom as you are surveying. So it would not be at the top.
Not at the top.
Yep.
Okay. All right. The reason I asked the question is I find where I live that
Mhm.
I can't swim in it. And I used to be a Division I competitive swimmer in
Mhm.
college.
Yep.
So it's not just my feet. I have feelings that I think are now obvious about this. And I, 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 I guess I can't buy enough benthic mats to make it swimmable. But we'll be interested to see.
Yeah,
see
and
what you come up with.
that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
I have a similar story. One of my staff members, she had to go out and do some snorkel surveys, and she was, she'd always been like, I don't know, like you can still swim in it, it's fine. And then we went out to one area where it was particularly dense, and she was like, I almost drowned out there. I couldn't
Yeah.
believe it. So,
Yeah.
so there are spots where it is really bad, and there are spots where it's not, and just trying to figure out the best way to, again, balance recreation versus also preserving our ecological benefits.
Mm.
That's where we're at.
Any other questions? Okay, well, let's move on. Oh, I'm sorry. We've got a question.
That's why I talked fast. I knew there'd be questions.
So I think another thing, Christina, it also depends upon the lake level, doesn't it?
Yep.
So if we have a full lake level year, the SAV doesn't appear to be as bad as if we have a -2 foot lake level year. So I think, again, when we start talking about these types of concerns that we're all trying to balance, that the environment changes rapidly and continuously every single year. It's something different. When we first started discussions regarding lake level back in 2008, 9, or 10, somewhere around there, it was, 1 year, it was, hey, we don't have enough water. We got problems all around the place. Then the next year, we had a full year and we had complaints because we couldn't fit underneath the Glenarm Bridge. So it's totally, every year is something different. So we have to really look at this from a balance standpoint. And that's just a point.
I was just going to say, this is a little outside of my area of expertise, but to your question, it might be possible to use satellite data to look over time at this kind of thing. And yeah, I just looked, there are some papers on the topic. I'd have to read them, but
And
it might be
and
possible.
we
to do
have
that.
been doing surveys throughout the years, so we do have survey data as well.
All right. No question? Okay. Well, let's move on. If people have other questions, we'll have the panel.